Part 3. Attack by the Nervii on Cicero's winter camp, 54 BC. 38. Elated by his victory, Ambiorix at once started with his cavalry for the country of the Atuatuci, which bordered on his kingdom, marching day and night without a halt. His infantry had orders to follow. Explaining to the Atuatuci what had occurred, he roused them to arms. The next day he reached the Nervii and urged them not to lose a chance of freeing themselves forever and avenging the wrongs they had suffered at the hands of the Romans. 2 generals, he told them, were killed and a large part of the Roman army annihilated. It would be easy to surprise and destroy Cicero's legion in its winter quarters. He promised to aid them in this enterprise and easily persuaded them to undertake it. 39. Accordingly, the Nervii hastened to send messengers to the tribes under their rule, the Cutrones, Gudii, Lewacae, Plumoxii, and Geidumni, and, raising as large a force as they could, swooped down on Cicero's camp before he had received news of Sabinus' death. Like him, Cicero could not help being taken by surprise. Some soldiers who had gone into the woods to get firewood and timber for building fortifications were cut off by the unexpected arrival of the enemy's cavalry. Then a large-scale attack on the legion was begun by the Eburones, Nervii, and Atuatuci, accompanied by their allies and satellites. The soldiers rushed to arms and mounted the rampart. A very hard day's fighting ensued because the enemy staked all their hopes on swift action and were confident that success in that engagement would assure them final victory. 40. Cicero immediately wrote to Caesar and offered large rewards to the couriers if they succeeded in delivering his letter, but all the roads were guarded and they were intercepted. During the night, the timber that had been collected for the defense work was used to build towers, as many as 120 of these being run up with incredible speed, and all defects in the fortifications were made good. Next day, the enemy, considerably reinforced, renewed their attack on the camp and filled up the trench, while the Romans resisted with the same determination. Similar attacks followed day after day, and work had to be continued throughout the night so that even the sick and wounded could get no sleep. Everything necessary for repelling the next day's assault was got ready by night, including large numbers of siege spears and stakes charred at the point. The towers were provided with additional stories and with wicker breastworks surmounted by a crenellated top. Cicero himself, though in very poor health, would not rest even at night until a crowd of soldiers actually went to him and by their remonstrances made him take care of himself. 41. At length a number of the Nervian leaders and chieftains who had some claim to consider themselves friends of Cicero and therefore entitled to speak to him asked for an interview. Their request was granted, and they told him the same as Ambiorix had told Sabinus, that the whole of Gaul was in arms, the Germans had crossed the Rhine, and the camps of Caesar and the other generals were being attacked. They also described the death of Sabinus, and, to prove the truth of their account, pointed to the presence of Ambiorix with their army. "You are mistaken," they continued, "if you expect any help whatever from troops who know that they are in extreme peril themselves. However, we have no quarrel with Cicero or the Roman people, except that we object to the establishment of winter camps in our country and do not want it to become a regular practice. As far as we are concerned, you can leave the camp without being molested and go where you please without fear." By way of reply, Cicero contented himself with saying that it was not the custom of the Roman people to accept any terms from an armed enemy. If they would lay down their arms and send an embassy to Caesar to ask for terms, he would support their request and hoped that Caesar in his justice would grant it. 42. After this disappointment, the Nervii surrounded the camp with a rampart 10 feet high and a trench 15 feet wide. They had learned something of the art of entrenchment by observing our methods in previous years, and also got hints from prisoners belonging to our army whom they had taken. But as they lacked the proper tools for the work, They had to cut the sods with their swords and remove the earth in their hands and in their cloaks. From this, one could get some idea of their great number. In less than 3 hours, they completed a fortified line 3 miles in circumference, and during the next few days set to work, under the prisoners' instruction, to erect towers high enough to overtop the rampart of the camp, and to make grappling hooks and sappers' huts. 43. On the 7th day of the siege, a great gale sprang up, and the enemy began slinging moulded bullets of red-hot clay and hurling incendiary darts at the huts in the camp, which, as usual in Gaul, were thatched. The huts quickly caught fire, and the strong winds spread the flames throughout the camp. The enemy raised a loud cheer, as if victory were now a certainty, and began to move up their towers and sappers' huts, and to scale the rampart with ladders. The defenders showed the greatest courage and coolness. They were surrounded by scorching heat and pelted with a hail of missiles, and knew that all their baggage, containing everything they possessed, was being burnt. Yet not a single man deserted his post on the rampart, and hardly anyone even turned his head to look at what was happening. Every man fought in this great crisis with the utmost energy and heroism. This was by far the worst day's fighting for them. Nevertheless, it ended in their killing and wounding more of the enemy than on any other day, because the Gauls were crowded in a tightly packed mass at the very foot of the rampart, and those at the back prevented the front ranks from retreating. When the fire had died down a little, one of the enemy's towers was pushed right up to the rampart at one point. The centurions of the 3rd cohort retired from the spot where they were stationed, withdrew all their men, and then made signs and called to the Gauls to come inside if they liked, but not one of them dared move. They were then driven from their position on the tower by a volley of stones from every direction, and the tower was itself set on fire. 44. In the legion were 2 very brave centurions named Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus, both of them nearly qualified for the 1st grade. They were always disputing which was the better soldier, and every year the competition for promotion set them quarrelling. When the fighting at the entrenchment was at its height, Pullo cried, "Why hesitate, Vorenus? What better opportunity do you want to prove your courage? Today shall decide between us." With these words he advanced outside the fortification and rushed into the thickest place he could see in the enemy's line. This brought Vorenus too over the rampart, hastening after his rival for fear of what everyone would think if he lagged behind. Pullo stopped a short way from the Gauls, hurled his spear, and transfixed one of them who was running forward from the ranks. The man fainted from the wound, and his comrades covered him with their shields, at the same time showering missiles upon Pullo and preventing him from advancing further. His shield was pierced by a javelin, which stuck in his sword belt, and as the blow knocked his scabbard out of place, he could not get his hand quickly to his sword when he tried to draw it, and was surrounded by the enemy while unable to defend himself. His rival Vorenus ran up to rescue him in his distress, and all the Gauls immediately left Pullo, who they thought had been mortally wounded by the javelin, and turned on Vorenus. Vorenus drew his sword, and fighting hand to hand killed one of his assailants and drove the rest back a little, but pressing on too eagerly, he stumbled down a steep slope and fell. It was now his turn to be surrounded, but Pullo came to his aid. Both of them escaped unhurt, and after killing a number of the enemy returned to camp covered with glory. Thus fortune played with them in their struggle for preeminence. Bitter rivals though they were, each helped and saved the other, so that it could not be decided which was the more deserving of the prize of valour. 45. Day by day the peril and hardship of the siege increased, especially as so many of the men were incapacitated by wounds that few were now available for the defence. As the situation became worse, Cicero made still more frequent attempts to get a letter through to Caesar. Some of the messengers were detected at once and tortured to death under the eyes of the soldiers. There was one Nervian in the camp, a man of good birth named Vertico, who had deserted to Cicero at the start of the siege and served him very faithfully. The man induced his slave, by the promise of freedom and a large reward, to carry a dispatch to Caesar. He took it tied round a javelin, passed through his fellow countrymen's lines without exciting any suspicion, and reached Caesar, who learned from him the perils that surrounded Cicero and his legion. 46. On receiving the dispatch in the late afternoon, Caesar at once sent a messenger to his quaestor Marcus Crassus, whose camp was 24 miles away in the country of the Bellovaci, ordering him to march at midnight with his legion and join him with all speed. Accordingly, Crassus left his camp with the messenger. Another message was sent to Fabius, bidding him march his legion into the country of the Atrebates, through which Caesar would have to pass on his way to Cicero's camp. He also directed Labienus to bring his legion to the frontier of the Nervii, if he could do so without risk. As the remaining legions were a long way off, Caesar did not think it advisable to wait until they could be assembled, but he collected about 400 cavalry from the nearest camps. 47. The next morning, on learning from Crassus's scouts that he was approaching, Caesar set out about 9 o'clock and marched 20 miles. He directed that Crassus, with the legion which he was bringing with him, should take charge of everything left behind at Samara Braiwa, the heavy baggage, the hostages furnished by the various tribes, the state papers, and the whole of the grain that had been collected to last through the winter. Fabius and his legion, in accordance with their orders, joined Caesar on the march without much delay. As for Labienus, he had heard the bad news about the destruction of Sabinus and the 15 cohorts. All the forces of the Treueri were close upon him, and he feared the consequences of a departure from his camp, which must look like a flight. The enemy would be sure to attack, and he doubted his ability to resist, especially as he knew that they were related by the recent Gallic victory. Accordingly, he wrote back to Caesar saying that it would be very dangerous for him to move his legion from its quarters. He described in detail what had happened in the country of the Eburones, and told him that the whole army of the Treueri, infantry and cavalry, had taken up a position 3 miles from his camp. 48. Caesar approved of Labienus's decision. Although this meant he had only 2 legions instead of the 3 he had expected, he thought that the only possible way to save the situation was to act quickly. He proceeded by forced marches to the territory of the Nervii, and there learned from prisoners what was happening in Cicero's camp, and how critical the position was. He then induced one of his Gallic horsemen, by the promise of a large reward, to convey a letter to Cicero, which he wrote in Greek characters for fear it might be intercepted and his plans become known to the enemy. If he was unable to get into the camp, the man was to tie the letter to the thong of a javelin and throw it over the rampart. The letter informed Cicero that Caesar was on his way with some legions and would be there shortly, and told him to keep up a bold front. The Gaul was afraid to enter the camp, and therefore threw the javelin in according to his instructions. It happened to stick in one of the towers, where it remained unnoticed for 2 days. Then a soldier saw it, pulled it out, and took it to Cicero, who after reading it paraded the troops and read it aloud, to their great joy. By this time the smoke of burning buildings was visible in the distance, which dispelled all doubt about the approach of the legions. 49. On hearing the news from their patrols, the Gauls raised the siege and marched out to meet Caesar with all their forces, about 60,000 men. With the help of Vertico, the man already mentioned, Cicero again found a Gaul to carry a dispatch to Caesar, in which he advised him to march warily and carefully, because the enemy had left the camp and diverted all their forces to oppose him. When the dispatch reached him, about midnight, Caesar informed his troops of its contents and told them to summon up their courage for a battle. At daybreak he broke up the camp, and had advanced about 4 miles when he saw the Gallic host on the other side of a wide valley with a stream running through it. It would have been very risky to fight on unfavourable ground with such a small force, and knowing that Cicero was now released from blockade, he felt that he had no cause for anxiety and had better take his time. He therefore halted and made a fortified camp on the most advantageous site he could find. The camp would have been small in any case, since he had barely 7,000 men and no heavy baggage. But he reduced its size still further by making the camp roads narrower than usual so that his forces would seem contemptibly small. At the same time, he sent out scouts in all directions to find the most convenient place for crossing the valley. 50. Some cavalry skirmishes took place that day near the stream, but the two armies maintained their positions. The Gauls were awaiting the arrival of larger forces. Caesar hoped, by feigning fear, to entice them onto his ground, and so to be able to fight in front of his camp on his side of the valley, or, failing that, to cross the valley and the stream with less risk by reconnoitering the available routes beforehand. At dawn, the enemy's cavalry came up to the camp and engaged the Roman horse. Caesar ordered them to give ground voluntarily and fall back into the camp, and told the legionnaires to increase the height of the rampart all round and block up the gateways. In doing so, they were to run about as much as possible and pretend to be afraid. 51. By these feints, the enemy were induced to cross the valley and form up in a disadvantageous position. After Caesar had enticed them still nearer by withdrawing his men from the rampart, they threw javelins from all directions over the fortifications, and sent heralds round with orders to announce that anyone, Gaul or Roman, who liked to come over and join them might safely do so before 9 o'clock. After that, no one would be admitted. They were so contemptuous of the Roman army that when they found the gateways blocked and thought they could not break in that way, though actually the barricades were shams, consisting of a single thickness of sods, they began to fill up the trenches and make openings in the palisade with their bare hands. Suddenly, while the infantry made sorties from all the gates, Caesar sent out the cavalry. The Gauls fled so precipitately that not a single one stayed to strike a blow. Many were killed, and all the rest threw away their weapons. 52. Caesar was afraid to pursue too far, because there were woods and marshes in the way, and because he saw that he would incur serious losses by abandoning his position. As it was, he joined Cicero the same day without having suffered any casualties. He saw with astonishment the towers, sappers' huts, and earthworks constructed by the Gauls, and, when Caesar's legion was paraded, found that not 1 man in 10 remained unwounded. He was thus able to realize how grave the peril had been, and with what resolution the defense had been conducted. He gave Cicero the high praise he deserved, congratulated the whole legion, and spoke individually to the centurions and military tribunes who were mentioned by Cicero as having specially distinguished themselves. Obtaining from prisoners more precise information about the fate of Sabinus and Cotta, he paraded the legion next day, described the disaster that had taken place, and reassured the men. The defeat, he said, was due to the blundering rashness of the general, and they had no reason to be upset about it, since with the help of Providence their valor had avenged it. The enemy's triumph had been short, and there was no need for them to be depressed any longer. Part 4. Widespread revolts in northern and central Gaul, 54 to 53 BC. 53. The news of Caesar's success was brought to Sabinus by the Nervii with extraordinary speed. He was more than 55 miles from Cicero's camp, and it was after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when Caesar reached it, yet before midnight some of the Nervii were shouting at the camp gates, announcing the victory and offering their congratulations. When the news reached the Trureri, Indutiomarus, who had intended to attack Labienus's camp on the following day, fled home in the night with all his forces. Caesar sent Fabius back to his camp with his legion, and decided to winter himself with 3 legions in separate camps near Samarobriua, and in view of the serious disturbances that had occurred, to remain with the army throughout the winter. Since the disaster in which Sabinus met his death became generally known, nearly all the tribes had been discussing warlike projects, sending messengers and embassies in all directions, trying to find out one another's plans and see who would take the initiative, and holding meetings at night in deserted spots. All through the winter, Caesar had scarcely a moment's respite from anxiety. He was continually receiving some report about plans for revolt. The questor Roscius, for example, whom he had placed in command of the 13th Legion, reported that large forces belonging to the tribes called Aremorican had assembled to attack him and had been within 8 miles of his camp, but on hearing of Caesar's victory had made off with a haste that suggested an army in flight. 54. Caesar summoned the leading men of each tribe, and partly by intimidation, letting them know that he was aware of what was going on, partly by persuasion, succeeded in keeping a large part of the country obedient. The government of the Senones, however, a very powerful tribe with great influence over the others, tried to kill their king Caurinus, whom Caesar had set on his ancestral throne in succession to his brother Mauretascus, who occupied it at the time of Caesar's arrival in Gaul. When Caurinus got wind of their intention and fled, they pursued him as far as the frontier, dethroned him, and banished him. On receiving a deputation sent to justify their action, Caesar ordered the whole of the tribal council to appear before him, but they disregarded his command. The fact that someone had been bold enough to take the initiative in hostile action made a deep impression on the ignorant natives, and produced such a profound change in their attitude that nearly every tribe was suspected by Caesar of disloyalty. Almost the only exceptions were the Aedui, whom he always held in special esteem for their long-standing record of unbroken loyalty, and the Remi, who had earned similar regard by their recent services in the Gallic campaigns. Perhaps there is nothing very surprising in their readiness to revolt. Among many other reasons, tribes which were considered the bravest and most warlike in the world naturally felt bitter resentment at the complete loss of this reputation which submission to Roman rule entailed. 55. Indutiomarus and the Treueri were particularly active. All through the winter, they never ceased sending embassies across the Rhine, intriguing with the German tribes, promising them money, and assuring them that the great losses which the Roman army had sustained had left only a small part of it in existence. Not a single German tribe, however, could be induced to cross the river. They said that they had twice had experience of the Roman arms, in the campaign of Ariovistus, and at the time of the migration of the Tencteri, and did not intend to tempt fortune again. In spite of this disappointment, Indutiomarus proceeded to raise and drill troops, to procure horses from the neighbouring states, and by large rewards to entice exiles and condemned criminals from all over Gaul to join him. Indeed, he soon acquired such prestige in the country by these measures that embassies poured in from all quarters, requesting his favour and alliance either for tribal governments or for individuals. 56. From these unsolicited overtures he inferred that he would have no lack of volunteers when he began to advance beyond his own frontier. In one direction were the Senones and Carnutes, incited to revolt by their consciousness of guilt, while on another side the Nervii and Atuatuci were preparing to attack the Romans. So he gave notice of a muster in arms. This is the customary method of opening hostilities in Gaul. A law, common to all the tribes alike, requires all adult males to arm and attend the muster, and the last to arrive is cruelly tortured and put to death in the presence of the assembled host. At this meeting, Indutiomarus declared his son-in-law, King Gauls, a public enemy and confiscated his property. King Gauls was the leader of the rival party and had remained faithful to Caesar since putting himself under his protection, as described above. Indutiomarus next announced to the assembly that his aid had been invoked by the Senones, the Carnutes, and several other tribes. He intended in due course to march to their country, ravaging the territory of the Remi on his way, but he would first attack Labienus's camp. He then gave the necessary orders. 57. Labienus was safe in a camp well protected both by its situation and by fortifications, and felt no anxiety for himself or his legion. His only concern was not to lose any opportunity of scoring a success against the enemy. Accordingly, When King Getorix and his relatives told him what Indutiomarus had said in the assembly, he sent messages to all the neighbouring tribes, calling upon them to supply contingents of cavalry by a certain date. Meanwhile, Indutiomarus came prowling round the camp nearly every day with all his cavalry, either to reconnoitre its position or to get into conversation with the soldiers, and usually all the horsemen tried to frighten them by throwing javelins over the rampart. Sabinus kept his men within the entrenchment and did all he could to confirm the enemy's belief that they were afraid. 58. Each day as he moved up to the Roman lines, Indutiomarus showed greater contempt for his adversary. Eventually, Sabinus brought into the camp in a single night the cavalry which he had summoned from all the neighbouring tribes, and by setting a guard succeeded so well in keeping all his men inside that there was no means by which the news could get abroad or be carried to the Trereri. Indutiomarus came up to the camp as usual and spent the greater part of the day there, his cavalrymen throwing javelins and shouting insults to provoke the soldiers to fight. They got no reply, and towards evening, when they felt like it, went off in scattered groups. Suddenly Sabinus sent out all his cavalry through two of the gates. He gave strict orders that as soon as the enemy were scared off and put to flight, as he foresaw they would be, every man was to look for Indutiomarus and not to strike a blow at anyone else until they saw him killed. For he was anxious that they should not give him time to escape by going in pursuit of the others. He set a big price on his head, and to make doubly sure sent some cohorts to support the cavalry. Fortune aided the plan that human foresight had devised. With every man after him, and him alone, Indutiomarus was caught and killed in the very act of fording a river, and his head brought back to camp. On their way back, the cavalry pursued and killed as many as they could, and all the forces which had assembled from the Eburones and the Nervii departed when they heard the news. This success made Gaul a little quieter for the time being.